First of all, let me extend a thanks to Ambassador, but also to the audience and the people who's watching us. And we have Ambassador Isnomo with us here, who is the ambassador for Indonesia to the Kingdom of Sweden, and as simultaneously also the ambassador to Latvia. And what we're going to do here today is, well, I should probably mention that priorly he was the director of the Social and Cultural International Organization of Developing States. And he got his education in St. Louis and Leeds. So that gives, I think, the ambassador a fantastic opportunity to both have a foot in Asia, a foot in the United States, and a foot in Europe, and to talk about the topic today, which is Indonesian presidency in G20. And I think this year's G20 has been extraordinarily important. And I guess that many people say that, but I think we have good reasons to talk about this. And one, of course, is the recovery after COVID-19. This has been an immense problem to get the world economy going again. But additionally, and I think that the pandemic has been probably something we could manage, and I think we did efforts to manage that through the Resilient Fund that is placed on the IMF. But I think even more important is the war in Ukraine and the conflict that threatens the world economy at large. I mean, as a European, I often get the impression that how we are affected by the conflict. But I think apart, of course, from the Ukrainians themselves that suffer immensely from the Russian invasion, the poor countries around the world suffers much more than Europe does. And you can really see the implications of the war in Ukraine internationally. And of course, that makes the G20 so much more important because all of these solutions are multilateral. At the same time, I think both the pandemic and the war in Ukraine has taught us that we cannot rely on globalization alone. We need also to fall back on bilateralism, unilateralism, but also minilateralism of different ways. And that puts, I think, the Indonesian situation extremely difficult. I was personally amazed that it was a joint statement. I thought that maybe that would not even happen. But we need those sort of engagement. We need that sort of common understanding how we're going to move forward in these difficult questions. And hopefully the ambassador can give us some insights. And of course, the audience, if you have questions, please post it online. And then hopefully we can reach a better understanding how Indonesia was able to pull this through, what you expect from the outcome of G20, and how do you see the future problems. So, Ambassador, I will leave the floor to you.
Thank you, Nicholas. But first and foremost, allow me to extend my heartfelt appreciation to NWOD as well as ISDP for having me here at your mini studio here in Stockholm. It is an honor and privilege, of course, to be here. And of course, after serving in Sweden for 2 years, and then having gone through pandemic halfway through my tenure here, it is indeed timely for me to reach out to many think tanks and academic centers throughout the country to discuss on issues that are of common concern. The way I would like to go through is I will talk about our presidency of the G20. And also in the beginning, I will also discuss briefly about the background about G20 itself. Why was it established? What was the raison d'etre of behind its establishment, and the idea of holding G20 meetings that could solve many issues that may not be able to be solved in many multilateral issues such as the UN and other multilateral forums. So just to begin, I would like to talk about the Indonesian presidency in G20, and I will start by a bit of a background why it was established. If we go to the next slide, as you know, the G20 was formed in 1999 and was originally a meeting of the Minister of Finance and the Governor of the Central Bank. So there is a lot of financial and monetary background behind the formation of G20, because at the end of the day, when politicians, when leaders formalize policies, make breakthroughs, there's always budgetary implications to it. And we need sometimes to make quick decisions at the global stage, to make important decisions, which always entails financial implications. And this is the reason why G20 was established in an effort to broaden the discussion on policies that are beneficial for resolving the global economic as well as financial crisis. Another point of backdrop that I'd like to discuss here was, you have to remember, when it was established in 1999, it was, I would say, inseparable from the disappointment of the international community over the failure of the G7 in finding solutions to the problems of the global economic at that time. So the G7 at that time was unable to rise to the occasion in terms of solving global financial and economic problems, because at that time there was a few of us, new rising middle economies, who also had a say, who also had a slight bit of power in shaping and forming the global settings and policies when it comes to finance and central banks. That's why G7 went beyond, and it added a few other countries, namely the newly middle income countries, Indonesia having been one of them, as well as countries that have sizable economic influence in their respective regions. Of course, EU is probably one member that is not a country as such, but EU being there, being a good economic force, where it was very important to be there. That's why henceforth we included EU as one of the a member of G20. If you could go to the next slide. So this is the membership of G20. As I said, these are the countries that were in addition to the already established G7. In terms of power, if you look at the slide, it's indeed 85% of the world economy. So that's how big it is. It is 79% of global trade. It is 65% of world's population, and that 9 of them are developing countries, developing economies, newly emerging economies, and also you have 11 developed economies as well. So that's the establishment and the membership of the G20. Next slide. So these are the series of chairmanships, as well as themes and events and countries that hosted a series of G20 summits. It all started, as you can see, in Washington, D.C., which I said earlier was a theme on financial markets and world economy. And then it goes all the way from London, US, Toronto, Seoul, all the way to Rome before arriving in Bali this year. And if you look at the theme, it always concentrates and surrounding the issue of finance and economy, because at the end of the day, policies, whether thematic or issues, at the end of the day has to be related with financial and monetary considerations. Next slide. So what was the theme of our chairmanship or presidency of the G20? Well, if you can see at the slide, we have our theme was recover together and also recover stronger. The theme of recover together is motivated by the rivalry of the great powers that threatened the world's recovery after the pandemic. So that was the first spirit, I would say, that captured the first part of our theme, which is recover together. A strong emphasis there on multilateralism, a strong emphasis on partnership and inclusivity, and also coming from a developing country, middle-sized economy, we want to ensure that our presidency is open and fair and also mutually beneficial for world economy. We have to remember when Indonesia took over the chairmanship, we had a huge backdrop there about regional rivalry, as I said earlier, and also the immense effects of pandemic. So that was the background. And then the second part of the theme was recover stronger. Of course, this had a lot to do with the pandemic because it takes a collective effort by all of us to really put our act together to recover together from this pandemic. Because no matter how many vaccines you produce, no matter how many efforts you put into when you confront the recovery and when you confront the pandemic, you need a collective of ownership and responsibility by key leaders of major economies to really focus and implement formalized policies that can actually make breakthroughs and transform the policies that have been going throughout the pandemic. If we proceed to the next slide. So this was the global challenges. As I said, there was uneven distribution and access of vaccine. We felt it as a developing country. The first year of pandemic, we really felt it, how difficult it was to get access to vaccines. We were very fortunate as a middle-income economy. We had sufficient reserves by which we used our reserves to pre-purchase vaccines from many developed countries. Even though we did that, it was not really successful because, of course, the unfortunate idea of vaccine nationalism was very pervasive during the first year of pandemic, understandably, because countries' leaders would have to address to their immediate constituents, immediate national interest. But if we go beyond that, I think what pandemic taught us that we need to abandon such thinking, and the solution would be to have leaders coming up together and try to find a solution. Because if we save only our nationals, what happened to the world? What happened to the norms and values of multilateralism, but cooperation? And the other gap is, of course, between the widening gap between developed and developing countries post-pandemic. Obviously, developing countries were hard hit by the pandemic, not just their economy, but also their reserves. Their GDP shrank by double digits. So these were the things that were causing the huge immense gap between the developed and developing world. And then there's also the picture of the global economy. The IMF forecasted in April this year that economic growth would decline by 4.4% to 3.6%. So this was important for us to get our act together. And also the immense looming crisis over energy, food, as well as financial crisis. So that was the backdrop. If we go to the next slide. So these were, in order to respond to these challenges, we need to really change the business as usual approach in G20, because previously G20 was a forum where we shaped the norms and values of various issues of global matters and global concern. But due to this extraordinary time, it was incumbent upon us to do something different, because we cannot just sit there idly by and pretend as if this is business as usual. People are dying because of lack of access to vaccine. People are dying because of the impact of war. People are dying because basic goods were not being circulated. Global supply chain were disrupted. So we had to come up with something concrete. So this is what we did. So we need to come up with something concrete, tangible, and very impactful to the ordinary people. So in Indonesia's G20 presidency, we wanted to ensure that sustainability was also in the agenda of development, which we refer to the chairmanship of Italy. And also throughout our presidency, we want to put forward a more inclusive principle in addressing various challenges, including coming from a developing country. Even though we are a middle income economy, but we never forget our past, because we know where we come from. We were in a difficult, challenging situation before. So we want to voice the interest and the concern of the developing world, the small and archipelagic countries. So this not only entail economic and development, this also entail survivability. Look at the archipelagic countries in the Pacific and also in the Indian Oceans. Their threat is not just economy, finance. Their threat is about rising sea levels. So there's a strong climate change elements into it. So that's why we brought forth the issue of climate change, not replacing COP26 or 27, but complementing to what is needed to bring a strong impetus of change in the COP process of negotiations. So next slide. So this is quite a mind-boggling structure of G20. You know, if you look at this, this is even more confusing than the UN structure. But essentially, we have the Sherpa track, which is, I would say, senior official level. And then there's the finance track. If you look at it, there's a huge plethora of issues under the finance. There's a working group on infrastructure, on international finance architecture, sustainable financing, so on and so forth. There is the ministerial meetings. If you look at them, there's quite a hefty of meetings of ministers throughout our G20s. And these are, of course, important. We had 14 ministerial meetings throughout our chairmanship. And if you look at the working groups under the ministerial track, there's 12 working groups. And also there's also what we call engagement groups, because G20 is not just government-led, but we also want to partner other international stakeholders. That's why we have the B20 there. B stands for business. So we involve all the 10, 15 top CEOs of these G20 member countries to also sit down, listen to their perspectives, listen to the business perspectives, and also they have to listen to the policymakers' perspectives, because in the end, we cannot avoid and neglect the view and perception of the private sectors, because they are the ones who ultimately keeps the economy rolling. But essentially, how do we keep the economy rolling in a responsible manner, in a responsible fashion, by taking strong emphasis on sustainability, on recycling, on renewable and new and renewable energies, and also, most importantly, green transition. Next slide. So these are our priorities. I mean, if you look at the topics, it would be virtually impossible for us to deal with every single one, because we only had 12 months of presidency, and we were being realistic. We cannot tackle every issue by itself. So for what can we do for 12 months? We shortened it down. We narrowed it down to 3 what we think is very important, very pertinent, and very relevant in today's challenges. Number 1, our priority is to strengthen global health architecture, because we came from the pandemic. So there is the need for the global health architecture to be improved, to be supported by the G20. So this is why we put this as one of our priority. Why do we think it's also important? Because if we can take care of the health sector, then it may not be as the impact on global economy, the impact on national economies may not be as severe. We witness countries drain their financial resources as much as 2/3 of their budget simply by catering to health services. I mean, this happened in developed countries, even in Europe. Now, can you imagine in poor developing countries who do not have the reserves, who do not have the resources to invest in their health services? That will take their entire budget, and not to mention their debt issues and challenges. Second, of course, is digital transformation. We thought that by focusing on this, we could catalyze the countermeasures of pandemic, and also to ensure inclusive digital transition from growth to development. And third, which is also important, which is very much related to COP26 and 27, which is the issue of energy transition. Why we focus on energy transition? Because we believe that the multilateral process of COP is already happening. We thought that if we could focus on energy transition, we could help the process of the climate change process. Why energy transition? Look at the countries there. These G20 has all the countries that possess all the necessary technology and brains to transform fossil fuel into 0% fossil fuels. And this is something that the G20 emphasized, the need for many countries to have the understanding that this technology should be available and should be affordable, not just in the developed countries, but also in middle income emerging economies. Because the issue there is not the lack of unwillingness of many countries to subscribe to climate change. It is the unavailability of technology, because countries like Indonesia, we have all the political will to commit ourselves to climate change, to energy transition. But at the end of the day, it's the technology that we need. We have the budget, we have the resources to buy energy transition. But again, coming from a middle income economy, if we buy these technologies, that means we have to sacrifice the budget for our health sector, for our technology sector, for our education sector, and for our other social budgetary. So it's about balancing the two, trying to find a common ground. So those were the three priorities which we thought were very highly relevant to today's challenges in the global setting. Next stage. I mentioned health architecture. This is something that we thought was important. So we galvanized not only the political leaders, but we also galvanized support from the finance ministers, the need for them to pay more attention to health financing, not only in their national respective needs, but also beyond that. We also make sure that the health ministers are also involved there. And we also make sure that the private sector are also aware of this, because at the end of the day, when it comes to vaccines, it's the private sectors who play a lot. It's not the government who produces vaccines. It's the private sector. It's the private pharmaceutical sectors that come up with these vaccines, and they need to be understand and sensitized that at the end of the day, when it comes to pandemic, flexibility should be involved when it comes to copyrights. Yeah. So next slide, if you may. The second, of course, is digital transformation. The need for connectivity, post-COVID recovery. We thought that digital is very important to provide new forms of growth, especially in the small and medium enterprise. These startup companies, they're very important. So not just a strong emphasis on that, but also the need for governments to provide as much as possible subsidies that could support and policies that could support small and medium enterprise, because they, at the end of the day, they are the ones who are absorbing many employments and also growth in all sectors. Next slide, if you could. And of course, the third, as I said, energy transition. We need to have concrete support from developed countries, for developing countries to offer affordable technology and investment. Our priority is to secure energy accessibility, to raise partnerships for universal energy access, and also smart and clean energy that needs to be scaled up. We need a global commitment to innovation and sustainable energy technology. And also the banking sector, the financial sector also needs to be briefed on this, because sometimes there is a disconnect between energy ministers, between energy companies, and the financial aspect of it. So there needs to be an understanding by the finance minister and also the banking sector that there needs to be an ease of interest policy when it comes to providing loans or providing grants involving clean technology. Next slide. So it all boils to last month. So we worked on that for as long as almost, I would say, 10 months. We had series of meetings at the ministerial level, at the expert level, and also at the business level. I would say that all in all, prior to the summit, we had 187 official meetings. Meanwhile, we also had 234 side events throughout our chairmanship. This was the meetings that was leading to the summit. So these are the pictures of the head of states who were present during the summit in Bali. As you can see, there are 17 of them. So I would say it is. I would say it's a fine accomplishment, because in G20s, not all leaders are usually present. But for us to be able to get 17 of them in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of global crisis, in the middle of a war, in the middle of a global rivalry, I think that's a separate accomplishment that we could tap ourselves in our shoulders. So the three leaders that were not present was, of course, the president of Russia, Brazil, and Mexico. So they were all represented by their foreign ministers. So next slide. So this was the venue where it took place. This is really not important. We can go to the next slide. So what are the takeaways? So these are the takeaways. I would say the salient points of the declaration. So number one, we were committed that G20 will remain agile and flexible in our macroeconomic policy responses and cooperation. What do we mean by agile and flexible? We mean, what do we mean by this is that we need to be flexible in drafting our budget, because we are faced by uncertain financial uncertain financial in the future. So we need to be agile, we need to be adaptive to more challenges that could arise. Secondly, is to protect macroeconomic and financial stability. That is very important, because in the end, as I said, G20 comprises 85% of global GDP. If we cannot imagine what happens to those 20 countries if their macroeconomy would collapse. I mean, I don't want to imagine. I think none of us would want to imagine. So that is the strong point, that all of us are committed to have a macroeconomic and financial stability. The third is to take action to promote food, energy security, and support stability to our markets. And then lastly, to unlock further investments for low and middle income and other developing countries, and recommit to accelerate SDGs. Next slide. And these are the other deliverables that I could say. Of course, much of this talk of G20, we cannot escape but ask the question of Ukraine. Of course, the war in Ukraine was very much present throughout our chairmanship. Of course, throughout our chairmanship, we were We were encouraged in a diplomatic way. We were quote unquote pressured about the role of Russia being in G20. But of course, we stood our grounds. We told all members of G20 that we should not forget the raison d'etre of G20, which is a forum for economic and finance. So we should try to focus without avoiding the current crisis in Ukraine. So there are two paragraphs in the Leaders' Declaration that were dedicated to the war in Ukraine, and we were able to finish and agree with that consensually. And of course, another issue that we need to highlight is that we agreed in the health sector to establish a pandemic fund to encourage additional contributions to the fund. And we managed to secure $1.5 billion from all G20 member countries. And this, by the way, Indonesia had committed $50 million for this funding. The other is, of course, creating a resilience and sustainability trust fund amounting to $81.6 billion that would be provided and dedicated to countries in need. And of course, it's obviously developing countries and at least developing countries so that they will not be severely impacted by the pandemic and global crisis. And also we were committed for the protection of at least 30% of the world's land area for conservation, and also 30% of world's oceans by 2030. We were also committed to reduce soil degradation up to 50% until 2040. On digital sector, we realized that there needs to be inclusive digital transformation and affordable digital connectivity. And lastly, of course, the much discussed energy transition sector. As a host and chair, we were grateful that we managed to pull through what do you call it? The Just Energy Transition Partnership, which we were granted $20 billion from various G20 member countries. This is a good start for us. And this would be a good, I would say, pilot project for other countries to follow. Of course, we are happy for this. Indeed, this would certainly help us to accelerate our energy transition policies. So before I conclude, we handed over our chairmanship to India. And India, of course, is a very strong country, both politically and economically, and also they have a strong and vibrant private sector. We very much support India's chairmanship under its theme, One Earth, One Family, One Future. And we are happy to support India on this. And the second point that I would like to raise before I conclude, that you mentioned before that it was a bit challenging to come up with an outcome. Sometimes when I wake up in the morning thinking of G20, I myself sometimes don't believe how we were able to pull it through. But I think the success of the story in Bali was that the ability of our president to convince other leaders that it's time for us to abandon our egotistic policy and to start thinking globally, to have this responsibility as world leaders of big countries, big and influential countries, to start rising up to the challenge and be responsible in solving the global issues. Because if we cannot solve this together, then we would just resort ourselves into another UN system. Because the trend now, as we all know, even though we support multilateralism, many other processes have been stalled or going on impasse in the multilateral sector. I think a forum like G20 is a potential forum where we can solve multilateral crisis, in a much more amicable and concentrated way by sitting down together around the table involving 19 countries and one strong regional organization. I know it's tend to not be inclusive. Some criticize it to be exclusive, but you can rest assured that Indonesia, as a member of G20, we will do our utmost to keep G20 as inclusive as possible. And we want to make sure that all the voices from other parts of the world, other regions, other sectors of the world are heard around the table in the G20. So I leave it at that, and I look forward for discussions with you, through you, Nicholas. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much. Ambassador Isnomo, this was very interesting, and I think you've maybe diplomatically underestimated the difficulties, because of course what we see is, I thought it was very enlightening, and I think you pointed out to some of the problems very distinctively. I mean, I've always been a free trade liberal myself, a free trade liberal that has, from my point of view, realized much of the difficulties with this maybe excessive freedom. And because I think exactly as you pointed out, the pandemic really showed the problem of what we saw as vaccine nationalism. And you picked three very difficult issues, and then you have the digital infrastructure. Well, the first thing that comes to mind is cyber warfare and disinformation campaigns and everything. And then, of course, the energy transition is what we suffer since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We trying to change the patterns. And these are, in a sense, energy has been used very much like a weapon from the case of Russia towards Europe. But that points to a number of challenges. And of course, one of the challenges is where to draw the line between multilateralism and this global engagement and that national security. And because I think it was very clear that even in the United States, certain states try to get hold of vaccines faster than others. In Europe, we definitely saw that some European states became very sort of state-oriented, and that's natural, exactly as you said. I mean, where do we draw the lines here? How much can be changed? And I have this personal vendetta with myself, in a sense, bilateral or sort of more focus on a nation state or the more focus on multilateral level. How do we draw it, and how do we find a balance? And if you can answer that question perfectly, I'm going to recommend you for the Nobel Prize. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Nicholas. I don't want to assume that I can answer your question, but I will do my best to address these challenges. As I said earlier, there is a huge challenge in multilateralism at this stage. You look at almost every issue that is at the disposal of the UN, starting from human rights, starting from Security Council, starting from disarmament. It has gone, I would say, nowhere. And it has been a subject to huge politicization. It has been a subject of huge abuse of veto power, if I may say.
You may say so, and I would agree.
Yes, we know that very well, because it was just 2 years ago that we came out of the Security Council. So we are still fresh from that memory. So there is this huge impasse in the UN system, because when we enter into the UN compound or the UN office, you can feel the vibe, you can feel the energy of animosity going on in the hall, in the rooms, in the meeting rooms, in the meeting sectors. You can find it in almost every committees, every councils, and every processes that are. But I'm quite optimistic, at least out of those processes, we still have one, I would say, a beacon of light, which is the UN climate change process that is still happening, that is still advancing at the moment. But that is, again, I would say, still fragile. And although a lot of good things came out of Sharm el-Sheikh for the damage and loss fund, I think the devil is in the detail within the 1-year process leading up to the chairmanship of the UAE. How do we materialize this loss and damage fund? But going back to your question, despite the UN, the multilateralism being as such, give that as it may, you have other forums like the G20, which is an amalgamation of various developed and newly developing countries. I would say this is a momentum, this is a forum where we can sit down in a different setting with a different vibe and energy, consisting of leaders in a retreat format, in a relaxed manner, trying to address and discuss and possibly identify possible solutions to the global conflicts. I think a forum as such should be further strengthened, I think, if I may, because if we do not have that willingness to sit down together and see things eye to eye in addressing global challenges, I cannot see where the world will be heading. We will be heading into a much more divisive world, God forbid. But a forum like a G20 is something that we could really address the issue straight on, honestly, and lastly, more importantly, responsibly. That is the key now, because we need to act, behave, and speak responsibly, because the world now is already have plethora of challenges at hand. The last thing we need is irresponsible policies, irresponsible narratives to dictate the way international affairs are headed. So what we need now is forum like G20 to interact in a responsible way and try to solve these problems. Although we are not able to solve, at least we could agree to solve it gradually, or we could agree to disagree about certain things and leave it at that for a few months, and then to try to discuss it again in a much more amicable way. I hope that answers your question. I mean, because it's a very tough world out there at the moment. But what we need, I think, is good, responsible decision making by decision makers.
So before I hand over the question to another, so basically, to a certain extent, the UN in its current form is, in a sense, obsolete. I mean, its best time was from the Second World War up to this end of the century. Now we're looking at minilaterals or medium laterals. Is that that's how I would see it? But would you agree to that?
I would say so, because again, the setting of such meetings, such organization, the way it is structured, it dictates the behavior of the negotiators. You see what I mean?
Yeah, I fully agree with you.
If you have countries, if you have delegations sitting on a table with their nameplates, suddenly you tend to forget that there are global challenges that needs to be addressed. And when we have negotiators sitting down with their nameplates, each of them would tend to think about their own national priorities, and then the global challenges seems to be overlooked. But if we have this minilateral meetings, such as G20 or others, I think that takes away this idea or setting that I'm talking about national interests. No, we're here, we're collectively here, try to address collective challenges. I think that's what's best.
Excellent. I'm going to hand over to one of the in-house participants here. Fabia, can you read that? I think I think we have to satisfy with that.
Following up to your discussion, I might say Dag Hammarskjöld said, created the UN not to take us to heaven, but to prevent us from hell. My question to you is, what has happened with the non-aligned movement? Because if the G20, as you describe, is the forum today, has the non-aligned movement vanished? Thank you.
Thank you, Fadil. Very good question. As you know, Indonesia was one of the founding fathers of the non-aligned movement, together with India, Egypt, and Ghana. And non-aligned movement continues to be the cornerstone of Indonesia's policy. If we go back to maybe 70 years or so, when 29 newly independent countries were gathered in the small city of Bandung in West Java, Indonesia, to declare what essentially is that these new developing countries, these newly independent countries, would do their utmost to create a more just world and a world that is more equal than it used to be prior to 1945. But that continues to be our, I would say, guiding path of Indonesia's foreign policy. It would be recognizable when you look at my presentation that there's a long element there on addressing the needs of many developing countries, be it health sector, be it digitalization, and also energy, because in energy we focused on the need to have affordable technology to help many developing countries acquire clean energy. So in terms of a non-aligned movement, they are still there. Of course, they should be contributing to many discourse. Unfortunately, that is not the case, but I think they are still there in terms of defending the needs and also the interests of many developing countries. But it takes perhaps a few members of the movement to also try to synthesize with them that we need to pick up a more adaptive policies when addressing to the global challenges. Of course, when we in the past talk about colonialism or neo-colonialism, I think the need that arises in the movement now is how do we also contribute to achieve the Paris Agreement, the climate change, how do we achieve the huge economic gaps? How do we need to achieve better access to health, better access to education, better treatment of women and girls in our countries, better improve fundamental freedoms in many developing countries? These are the issues that at least Indonesia wants to address in the movement. Whether we see it eye to eye on things like these issues, we are, but there are certain that sees it differently, I would say. But again, a movement is a movement. It's not an organization as such, but we continue, Indonesia, together with some other countries in the movement, we continue to encourage other members of movement that to begin to focus on issues that are relevant to today's world, which is, addressing the huge economic gaps, addressing the climate change, addressing fundamental freedoms, women's and girls' rights, human rights, democracy. These are the sort of things that we want to issue. I think, in essence, the movement has a lot of housekeeping work to do at the moment, but nevertheless, we continue to encourage them to see things eye to eye with global challenges.
One of the things that the big challenge that comes up is really, what you're saying here, we have the climate change problem, but we also have the right to the development for underdeveloped and developing states. We have the challenge that is, for example, that 30% of the world's oceans should be under protection. At the same time, we've never been so many on the planet Earth.
Yeah.
So we all have an overpopulation problem. I mean, how? I don't see the math adding up necessarily here. I mean, I'm just thinking about the Chinese fishing fleet that moves out. Because they have a larger population than most states, but they also have less arable land than many other states have, so they're forced out. So how do we do that? I mean, how do we? And of course, the challenge, people say that the richer countries should do more. Absolutely, and I think that's fair to say. But the developing countries also need to be restricting itself if you're going to manage this climate crisis. And do you see that feasible? I mean, I'm rather pessimistic when I add up all this, because I do understand that teenagers in Jakarta or Stockholm or whatever you want to go in the world, Johannesburg, they all want the same, make up the right to travel. They want to see the world, education. How can we restrict that? And how do we do? I mean, we have to somehow, but this is extremely complicated. And how do you deny states the right to develop as quickly as they want to do?
Yeah. Good question, Nicholas. I think if you look even more on the figures and statistics of global population, the growth of this population in the developing countries, and also the emerging and growing gap between the developed and developing countries, it is certainly a concern of many, not just us, but many. But in terms of how we address this, I think, number one, we need a rules-based order in solving these problems. But also don't forget that developing countries, the poor countries who are faced with many challenges, they also need to be to solve these problems based on international rules-based orders as well. You have these countries that are weak, that sometimes cannot defend their resources, cannot defend their territorial integrity. How are they supposed to protect their well-being? Again, this is where the rules-based order comes. And in terms of how do we strengthen the rules-based orders, I think it boils down to a few states or several countries to really lead by example. I think that's the key word. If you have just a few countries being in a developed or in the developing world, work together in such a close manner and solve issues that are somewhat related to what we all face every day, the global challenges, and are able to solve, I think this would be a good way for other countries to emulate in the future. I think what we need now, and I think what the world lacks now, is positive examples. Positive examples by countries to solve one problem. And then once it is solved, I'm very much sure that many countries will try to copy or emulate from the success of this. So we need success stories. How do we come up with success stories? It just takes a few world leaders to get their strong commitment into it and to think beyond their national interest and then deliver and then showcase this to the world, saying that, look, we managed to do this, whether it's environment, whether it's population, whether it's health, whether it's international sovereignty, whether it's IUU fishing. We just need a few positive examples. And then judging from what the world has endured for the past 2 years, I think positive examples is, a rarity now. And I think we need that.
I think you're right. I mean, especially as we do have a geopolitical conflict between the rules-based section and the authoritarian section. So, let's welcome that. Josephine, you had a question there.
Yeah, so thank you, Ambassador, for an excellent presentation. So here, 5 minutes until this excellent seminar and webinar is over. I would like to ask you, now that India is taking the presidency of the G20, could you just come with the one most important thing that Indonesia have learned by holding such a big event as G20, and one thing that you might recommend the Indians take into consideration? What could be improved, and or what could be, integrated in future G20 summits? Thank you so much.
Very good question. Well, as you know, India is a very influential country. We are here not to tell or lecture what India needs to do, because I'm very certain that they already know what to do. But if I can share what we did and what we did for the past year, I think what needs to do is we have to go beyond the usual diplomatic relations. There has to be a good back channel of communications between all the leaders, and also not just the leaders, the stakeholders as well. Because when we talk about G20, it's not just the policymakers, it's also the actors on the ground, the private sectors, the influencers, the civil societies. These are the ones that needs to be reached out and to be involved. Secondly, I think as well is as much of the problems or challenges are also mostly coming or impacting the developing world, we need also to reach out to the developing world. What can be done? What can be addressed? What are the needs to be addressed in this? But of course, I'm pretty sure India has all this already equated in their formulation and strategy. But all I can say is I wish India all the best and success. And of course, in G20, we have this Troika arrangements where the outgoing, current, and incoming chair will work together. And the Troika for this year is Indonesia as the outgoing chair. Sorry, Indonesia as the outgoing chair, India as the current chair, and Brazil as the incoming chair. So what do you have there? We have three powerful developing economies steering the agenda of G20. I hope this will be a good opportunity for the world and also G20 to at least minimize the gap between the developed and developing world. I leave it at that. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Ambassador. This has been very interesting. But what strikes me is the old Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. No, and I agree with you. I think India has this, they know what they want to do. And I think Indonesia knew what they wanted to do. And I was immensely surprised how well Indonesia managed this, in a positive surprise. Even if, of course, there are always challenges with these meetings. We always wish we accomplished more. But I think one of the big successes was really to get American and Chinese to sit down and talk.
Yes.
At the highest level. I mean, and I think that those meetings is not only about what is written on paper.
Yeah.
It is also what is said over that coffee or that tea in the corridor running to the next session, etc. And I do hope that India has an easier time than Indonesia had, and that India lives in less interesting times, that we might see an end to the war in Ukraine, God willing, but also that we see a relaxation of this global tension that we see today.
Yes.
So my greatest admiration, actually, that Indonesia successfully completed this. With all the drawbacks and all the successes, I think it was more than could be expected. So thank you for this presentation and thank you for your good work.
Thank you, Nicholas. Well, even though we ended our G20 chairmanship, our work, Indonesia's work, doesn't end here. We are going to be the chair of ASEAN, the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And fortunately, Sweden will take over the presidency of the European Union, the same day where Indonesia will take over the chairmanship of ASEAN, which is 1st January 2023. And I'm certainly looking forward to work together with Sweden, where we can bring a closer and productive collaboration between EU and ASEAN.
So we can live in interesting times together.
Yes. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Ambassador.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.